Kia ora koutou katoa. The Gospel reading for today brings together three stories of healing. One is about a tax collector who got up and left it all behind. One is about a bleeding woman who was on the fringe. And one is about a young dead girl who received a hand in her own. And between story 1 and 2, set in the context of an inclusive meal, there is a wisdom saying from the book of Hosea: I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Sacrifice could be translated in a modern, amplified way as anything related to worship of God, like prayers and singing, readings, communion, all the things that our forebears usually imbued with a holy hue. And mercy, in the words of the moral theologian James Keenan, is the willingness to enter into the chaos of others. It's a way of being, seeing, and responding to others. And in Hosea and in the Jesus communities that formed that Gospel of Matthew, entering into the chaos of others has priority over entering into the activities of worship. Dining with tax collectors and sinners was the way to enter into the chaos of others, and thereby into the very kingdom of God. These three stories may or may not have been part of the historical ministry of Jesus. Instead of assuming facticity, we need to start with Jesus groups in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, in the late 1st century, that is some 60 plus years after the death of Jesus. For it's likely that the stories of the tax collector, the hemorrhaging woman, and the sick girl resonated with the lived experience of people in those Jesus groups, for they were people on the fringe, the margins of society. As the biblical scholar Warren Carter says, the Jesus groups welcomed people to their meal who were despised, marginalized by other groups, whether by occupation, gender, religious non-observance, socio-economic status, actions, and so on. Jesus groups formed an open, alternate, inclusive community society, not constituted by conventional status markers like ethnicity and wealth, constituted also by the upturning of gender hierarchies. Maybe in that alternate meal context, members of Jesus groups told their personal stories, stories of hardship, exclusion, violence. Not unlike what Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his fellow panelists heard during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings in the late 90s. Stories of enduring shame and suffering. And in the retelling, finding some healing, more or less, some repowering of their lives. And maybe in the telling, they connected their stories with other earlier stories in the Jesus movement. And those stories have come down to us today in texts like the one set for this morning. For this is the power of story, to hear it as our own, to allow it to offer some healing, to hear it in hope. So, story 1. It's about a man who worked for the violent invaders, the Romans, by collecting money, by fair means or foul, to prop up their empire and to also profit his own purse. Tax collectors took a percentage, usually a large percentage, of the takings for their own. Tax collectors were characterized as thieves, thugs, and Roman lackeys. It was thus an occupation of shame, kind of like working for big tobacco when we knew that it killed. And money, though it did and still does, regardless of its source, bring a semblance of respect. Most ordinary people out of the earshot of the authorities were scathing and scornful of tax collectors. This story is one verse long. Jesus came, disrupted, left. And Matthew followed. Matthew chose to leave behind the position of power, security, money, and status, and join with an alternate community, an alternative to the normal operating procedures of the empire. The text identifies the critics of both Jesus and Matthew as Pharisees. We need to be careful with this word, lest we fall into the anti-Semitic assumptions of the past. The Pharisaic movement was actually a broad-based reform movement, taking the understanding of faith and worship from the Jerusalem temple into synagogues and homes. Jesus was part of this reform movement. Yes, Jesus was a Pharisee. It's like labeling the critics of Lloyd Gearing leading up to the 1967 heresy trial as Presbyterian, and then going on to assume that every Presbyterian thought the same and wanted Lloyd found guilty. Whereas, of course, Lloyd himself was Presbyterian, and the majority of Presbyterians at that General Assembly in 1967 cleared him of all charges. So it's much better to understand Jesus' critics in our text today as an elite alliance of religious leaders opposed to Jesus. Not all religious leaders, some religious leaders. And as members too of a governing class committed to maintaining the unjust hierarchical status quo. The other word in this text that we need to be careful of is the word sinners. For then as now it's a useful moniker for anyone you dislike or disagree with. Kind of like the word heretic. In this context, sinners was particularly used of women by traditionalists who did not approve of their presence at public meal tables. Such women were regularly labelled as prostitutes or slaves, regardless of their status, their social status, or their role at the meal. Story number 2. The sick daughter and the important father. But note that this story is carefully woven, purposefully woven, into story 3, that of the sick, hemorrhaging woman. This process of weaving these two stories by start off with the sick daughter, then hemorrhaging woman, go to the sick daughter. It's a process called intercalation. And we're meant to read each story in the light of the other. For both are about women, one young, one older. Both are suffering, one for 12 years, one dying from her suffering. And remember, no morphine about in those days. Both women have crossed the socially constructed barrier between clean and unclean, between defiled undefiled and defiled. One through bleeding, one through death. Both touch with Jesus, thus also defiling him. One touches the fringe, the tassels on the bottom of his prayer shawl, and one Jesus takes by the hand, which is probably one of the most radical verses in the whole of the Christian scriptures. Young girls were on the bottom of society's power pyramid. In most places they still are. And she is dead, defiled, polluted by death. But Jesus takes her hand. He reaches into the stigma, the chaos, as James Kinnan would say, the suffering of this wee outsider, and invites her, indeed all of the marginal, into a different, alternate future. I don't believe Jesus resuscitated her, or that her carers had misinterpreted her symptoms and erroneously thought that she was dead, or that she was just sleeping, or that God and Jesus suspended the divide between dead and alive and brought one who is dead alive again. What I do believe is that Jesus had the courage called faith, and inspired people to carry on after his death that courage by forming groups of misfits, odds and bods, who would enter into the chaos of others' lives. Mercy. What I do believe is that men in despised and shamed occupations, like that tax collector on that day in that booth, found the courage called faith amongst these groups of misfits. What I do believe is that women suffering from the stigma of long-term sickness, long-term shaming, and long-term labeling found the courage called faith to join this table fellowship of misfits. And in the acceptance found in their storytelling, a healing. And what I do believe is that young girls, dependent and suffering, can experience the faith, the courage called faith, from people who love them, parents, caregivers, and people who take hold of their hand, reaching across the barriers to gently invite them into alternate possibilities. Possibilities that bring life, not death, that bring promise, not pain. Life out of death, promise out of pain. Our task, calling, as a Jesus group today, is simply to enter into the chaos of others' lives, especially those on the fringes of power, especially those who are suffering, to invite them into an alternate, accepting and inclusive community, into an oasis of mercy. Blessings to you this week.